My husband treats my daughter like a criminal for a B- and rewards his own son for failing 3 classes. I met Kevin when my daughter Zoe was 6 years old. He seemed like a good man back then. He had a steady job at a car dealership and a son named Austin who was a year older than Zoe. Kevin said he wanted a real family. He said he always dreamed of having a house full of kids and dinners together and someone to come home to. I believed him. Zoe's biological father left before she was born, so I thought Kevin was a gift. I thought he was going to be the dad she deserved. We got married when Zoe was 8. That's when things started to change. Kevin had rules for Zoe that he did not have for Austin. Zoe had to finish all her homework before she could watch television. Austin could play video games whenever he wanted. Zoe had a bedtime of 8:30 even on weekends. Austin stayed up until 11 most nights. Zoe had to eat everything on her plate, including the vegetables. Austin lived on chicken nuggets and french fries because Kevin said he was a picky eater, and we should not force him. I brought it up once in the first year. I said it seemed like the kids had different standards. Kevin said Austin had been through a lot with the divorce and needed extra patience. He said Zoe was younger, so it was important to build good habits early. He said I was overthinking it and making problems where there were none. I let it go because I wanted peace. Zoe was a good kid. She followed the rules without complaining. She did her homework on time. She cleaned her room without being asked. She said please and thank you and helped me with dishes after dinner. Austin never did any of those things. But Kevin said boys were just different. He said Austin would grow out of it eventually. By the time Zoe was 12, the gap was impossible to ignore. Kevin checked Zoe's grades online every single day. If she dropped from an A to a B, he would sit her down for a lecture about responsibility and potential. He made her do extra practice problems on weekends. He took away her phone for a week once because she got a C+ on a math quiz. Meanwhile, Austin was barely passing anything. His teacher sent emails about missing assignments. His report cards were full of D's and comments about lack of effort. Kevin always had an excuse. He said Austin was not being challenged enough. He said the teachers did not understand his learning style. He said some kids were just not built for traditional school. I paid for everything in our house. My job as an accountant covered the mortgage, the utilities, the groceries, the car payments. Kevin's commission at the dealership went up and down, so most months I carried us. He never thanked me for it. He acted like it was normal for me to work 50 hours a week while he criticized my daughter for not being perfect. Last November, Zoe brought home her report card. She had 5 A's and 1 B- in science. She was nervous to show Kevin because she knew how he would react. She was right. Kevin looked at that report card like she brought home a criminal record. He said a B- was unacceptable. He said she was getting lazy and needed a wake-up call. He grounded her for 2 weeks. No phone, no friends, no television, no nothing. Zoe cried in her room all night. I went to comfort her, but Kevin told me I was coddling her. He said she needed to learn that the real world does not give participation trophies. That same week, Austin's report card came in the mail. He failed English, math, and history, 3 Fs in 1 semester. Kevin looked at it and sighed like it was a minor inconvenience. He told Austin to try harder next time, and then asked him if he wanted to go get ice cream. I watched my daughter do extra homework at the kitchen table while my stepson ate a sundae on the couch. Something broke inside me that night. I did not say anything right away. I waited until Sunday dinner when everyone was at the table together. Kevin was talking about how Austin's basketball team might make the playoffs. He was so proud. He said Austin was really finding his confidence on the court. I waited for him to finish. Then I asked Kevin a question. I asked him why Zoe was grounded for a B- when Austin failed 3 classes. Kevin stopped chewing. He said those were different situations. I asked how. He said Austin was dealing with a lot of pressure from basketball. I asked what pressure Zoe was dealing with when she had a stepfather who treated her like a criminal for not being perfect. Kevin's face turned red. He told me not to start this in front of the kids. I said the kids already knew. I said Zoe had known for years that she was held to a different standard than Austin. I said Austin probably knew too, even if he never admitted it. Kevin pushed back from the table. He said I was being dramatic and ruining dinner. I said I was being honest for the first time in 6 years. I asked him again to explain why my daughter was punished for a B- when his son failed 3 classes. He could not answer. He just sat there getting redder and angrier. I stood up from the table before I could change my mind. The chair legs scraped against the floor so loud it made both kids flinch. Kevin pushed his plate away and walked out of the dining room without looking at any of us. His footsteps pounded up the stairs, and then our bedroom door slammed hard enough to rattle the picture frames in the hallway. The sound hung in the air for a few seconds while nobody moved. Zoe kept her eyes on her plate like she was studying it for a test. Austin pulled out his phone and started scrolling, even though he knew phones weren't allowed at dinner. I watched him do it and didn't say anything because what was the point? The rules only applied to 1 kid in this house anyway. I could hear Kevin pacing back and forth upstairs. The old floorboards creaked with every step. Zoe finally looked up at me with those big brown eyes that always made my chest hurt. She looked scared and guilty at the same time, like she thought this was somehow her fault. I wanted to tell her it wasn't, but my throat felt too tight to get words out. I cleared my throat and told both kids to go to their rooms. Zoe got up right away without arguing. She carried her plate to the sink and rinsed it off, even though I didn't ask her to. Austin just sat there scrolling for another minute before he finally stood up and left his plate on the table with food still on it. The house got very quiet except for the pacing upstairs. My hands were shaking when I started picking up the dishes. I scraped Austin's leftover chicken and potatoes into the trash. Then Zoe's plate with her vegetables, which she ate even though she hated green beans. Then Kevin's plate with his half-eaten dinner. The trash can filled up with wasted food and wasted money and wasted years. An hour went by before I heard Kevin's footsteps on the stairs again. I was loading the dishwasher when he walked into the kitchen. He went straight to the refrigerator and asked if there was any dessert left. His voice was calm, like nothing had happened. I stopped and told him we needed to finish the conversation. His jaw got tight. He said there was nothing to finish and I was making a big deal out of nothing. I asked him if treating our kids differently was nothing. He slammed the refrigerator door and said I embarrassed him in front of the children. We went back and forth for 2 hours. Kevin kept saying Austin needed different support because of his learning style. He brought up the divorce again, like it happened yesterday instead of 8 years ago. I asked him why Zoe's trauma didn't count. Didn't having a father who abandoned her before she was born deserve some compassion too? He couldn't answer that. Kevin finally gave up around midnight and went to bed. I stayed downstairs at the kitchen table with a notebook and a pen. I started writing down every single thing I could remember. Every time Kevin checked Zoe's grades but ignored Austin's missing assignments. Every time Zoe got punished for small things while Austin got away with big things. By the time I finished, it was almost 2 hours in the morning, and I had filled 3 pages front and back with dates and examples. Seeing it all written down made it impossible to deny. This wasn't in my head. This had been happening for years while I stayed quiet and hoped it would get better on its own. Kevin left for work early the next morning without saying goodbye. The kids came down for breakfast quiet and careful, like they were afraid of making too much noise. After Austin left for the bus, Zoe finally spoke. In a tiny voice, she asked if we were getting divorced. I told her honestly that I didn't know what was going to happen, but things needed to change. I called in sick to work and spent the day at the kitchen table with our bank statements and bills. I made a spreadsheet. 1 column for what I paid, 1 for what Kevin paid. The mortgage, in my name only, was $200 a month. I paid all of it. Utilities, groceries, car payments, insurance, internet, cell phones, Zoe's school supplies, all of it mine. When I added it up, I was covering 90% of our household costs. Kevin came home that evening with pink roses from the grocery store, plastic wrap and all. He said maybe we should just forget the whole thing and start fresh. I looked at the flowers and told him fresh starts required actual change, not apologies and flowers. I showed him my 3-page list. Then I showed him the financial spreadsheet. His face went from normal to bright red in about 5 seconds. He said I was keeping score like a child. I said I was keeping records because he wouldn't take accountability any other way. I threw the roses in the trash while he watched. He flinched like I'd slapped him. He accused me of ambushing him at dinner in front of the kids to make him look bad. I told him the only person who made him look bad was himself, for not having an answer to a simple question about fairness. I read him examples from my list out loud. Dates, specifics, side-by-side comparisons. He tried to interrupt, tried to grab my phone. I stepped back and kept reading. He said I was twisting normal parenting into something that sounded like abuse. I asked him to explain how grounding a child for a B- was normal, and how 3 Fs earned ice cream. He had nothing. He slept in the guest room that night. The next day, I took Zoe to a coffee shop, just the 2 of us. Over hot chocolate, I asked her how long she'd known about the different rules. Her hands started shaking. She said she'd known since she was 9. She said she thought it was because she wasn't good enough, that if she just tried harder and got better grades, Kevin would be proud of her too. I felt like someone punched me in the stomach. My 12-year-old had spent 3 years blaming herself for her stepfather's favoritism. I told her none of this was her fault. She cried for real then, big tears in the middle of the coffee shop. I moved to her side of the booth and held her until her hot chocolate went cold. I called Zoe's school counselor, Tina Barker, and told her everything. Tina said she'd noticed Zoe was anxious and a perfectionist. She agreed to see Zoe weekly and gently reminded me that if things didn't improve at home, she'd have documentation on file. That weekend, I started tracking everything in real time. Every rule enforced for Zoe and ignored for Austin. Every moment of warmth given to one child and withheld from the other. By Sunday night, I had 11 new examples from 3 days alone. When Kevin saw me documenting it on my phone, he called me paranoid, said I was looking for problems because I wanted to be right. I told him I wished I was wrong. I wished he treated both kids fairly. But the evidence said otherwise, and I wasn't going to ignore it anymore. Austin's school called for a mandatory conference about his failing grades. Kevin wanted to go alone. I reminded him I was the one paying for the roof over Austin's head, so I'd be there too. At the conference, 3 teachers laid it out plainly. Austin was bright, but put in 0 effort. Kevin made excuse after excuse. Basketball pressure, learning styles, boring curriculum. I watched the teachers exchange looks. I interrupted and asked what consequences the school recommended. Austin was placed on academic probation, with basketball eligibility on the line. In the car, Kevin exploded, said I'd undermined him in front of the teachers. I pulled over into a parking lot and told him plainly, my name was the only one on the house deed. My income paid for everything, and if he wanted to keep living in my house, he needed to start treating both kids fairly. He called it threatening. He called it abuse. I called it the truth, finally spoken out loud. He didn't speak to me for 2 days. On the second night, Zoe knocked on my door, small and scared, asking if the fighting was because of her grades. I pulled her into a hug and told told her clearly and firmly that adult problems were never her responsibility. Kevin eventually proposed a compromise. Same bedtime for both kids, more homework checks for Austin. I told him that addressed maybe 10% of the problem and didn't touch the years of damage already done to Zoe's self-worth. I insisted on marriage counseling. He resisted, said we didn't need strangers in our business. I told him it wasn't optional. Counseling or divorce lawyers, his choice. In our first session, the counselor asked Kevin for specific examples of how he supported both kids equally. He couldn't produce a single one. She gave us homework, one-on-one time with both children. Kevin took Austin to a basketball game and canceled on Zoe twice with vague excuses. Meanwhile, Austin's grades kept sliding, an F now instead of a D. Kevin wanted to hire a tutor. I said no. Austin didn't need more support. He needed consequences. I set a new rule: no games, no going out, until his grades hit sea level across the board. 3 days later, Austin cheerfully told me Kevin had let him play video games anyway, calling it encouragement. I found Kevin on the couch and asked him directly if he'd broken the rule behind my back. Kevin didn't look away from the TV. He said Austin needed encouragement, not punishment, and an hour of gaming was a reasonable reward for trying. I told him that wasn't his call to make. I told him we had agreed on this rule together in front of the counselor, and he had gone behind my back within 3 days. Kevin said I was overreacting. I said I was done being ignored in my own house. I picked up the remote and turned off the television so he'd have to actually look at me. I told him this wasn't about video games. It was about him constantly undoing consequences the moment they became inconvenient for Austin, while never once easing up on Zoe. He didn't have an answer. He just sat there with his jaw tight, staring at the blank screen. At our next counseling session, I brought it up. I told the counselor exactly what happened: the new rule, the secret permission, the excuse about encouragement. She turned to Kevin and asked him directly why he felt comfortable overriding an agreement we'd made together. Kevin fumbled through an answer about Austin needing positive reinforcement. The counselor asked when the last time was that he'd offered Zoe the same kind of positive reinforcement for her 5 A's. He couldn't answer that either. She said something that stuck with me. She said patterns like this don't usually change through small compromises. They change when the person benefiting from the imbalance finally feels the consequences of it themselves. That week, I stopped smoothing things over. When Kevin complained that money was tight because his commission check was low, I reminded him that my name was on the deed and my income was the only reason we hadn't fallen behind on anything. When he asked me to cover Austin's basketball camp fee, I told him that was his responsibility as Austin's father, not mine. Kevin started to notice slowly that the house ran differently when I stopped absorbing every cost and every excuse without question. Zoe's sessions with Tina helped more than I expected. Within a month, she stopped apologizing for things that weren't her fault. She started talking back, respectfully but clearly, when Kevin tried to lecture her over small things. One evening, he criticized her for staying up 20 minutes past her bedtime to finish a chapter of a book. Zoe looked at him and said, "Austin stays up past midnight every night." Kevin opened his mouth to argue and then closed it, because there was nothing left to say. Austin's grades didn't improve overnight, but with the new rule actually enforced, no games, no going out, until his grades came up, he started turning in assignments again. Not because he suddenly loved school, but because for the first time, there were real consequences he couldn't escape by charming his way around them. Kevin resented every bit of it. He complained in counseling that the house felt like a boot camp now. The counselor asked him if he thought fairness and structure were the same thing as cruelty. He didn't like that question much either. 6 months after that first dinner where I finally asked him why Zoe was grounded for a B-, while Austin got ice cream for 3 Fs, things looked different. Not perfect. Kevin still slipped into old habits sometimes, still had to be corrected, still bristled every time I brought up the deed or the spreadsheet. But Zoe walked taller. She stopped flinching when she got a grade below an A. She started believing, slowly, that she'd never needed to be perfect to be loved. I didn't get an apology that fixed everything. I didn't get 6 years back, but I got my daughter's confidence back, piece by piece. And I got a house where the rules finally applied to both kids the same way. That was worth more than any bouquet of grocery store roses Kevin ever brought home. I found Kevin in the living room, remote in hand, still avoiding my eyes. I asked him again, straight out, if he'd let Austin play video games behind my back. He finally muttered that it was just an hour, and I was making too big a deal out of it. I told him this wasn't about an hour. It was about him quietly overturning something we'd agreed on the moment it became inconvenient. I reminded him what the counselor said, that these patterns don't shift through small compromises. They shift when the person benefiting from the imbalance actually feels consequences. So I gave him one. I told Kevin that starting that week, any grocery money, gas money, or spending cash he wanted from our joint account would need to go through me first. The same way Austin's privileges now went through me first. If he wanted to undermine structure in this house, he could feel what it was like to have no control over his own either. He was furious. He said I was treating him like a child. I told him that was exactly the point. He'd spent years making Zoe feel like a criminal for a B- while treating Austin's failures like they didn't matter. And now he'd get a small taste of what it felt like to have someone else control the terms of his life. He didn't touch a cent without asking for 2 weeks. At our next counseling session, the difference was obvious. Kevin came in more subdued than usual. The counselor asked how the week's homework had gone, and this time, Kevin actually admitted something real. He said he realized he'd been harder on Zoe because she wasn't his, and easier on Austin because guilt over the divorce made him want to protect his son from ever feeling like a failure, even when failure was exactly what Austin needed to face. It was the first time in 6 years he said something honest instead of defensive. The counselor asked what he planned to do differently. Kevin said he wanted to try. Not perfectly, just try. I didn't trust it completely yet, but for the first time, I saw an opening instead of a wall. 2 weeks later, Austin brought home a C+ on a history test, his first passing grade in months. Kevin high-fived him and then, without me prompting him, turned to Zoe at dinner and asked about her science project. He listened. He asked follow-up questions. He said, unprompted, "That's really impressive, Zoe." Zoe looked at me across the table like she couldn't quite believe what she'd just heard. I didn't say anything. I just let the moment be hers. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Kevin still slipped sometimes. An old habit here, a double standard there. But every time I called it out immediately instead of letting it slide for years like before. And every time he corrected it faster than the last. 6 months after that dinner where I finally asked him why my daughter was punished for a B- while his son got ice cream for 3 Fs, our house felt different. Quieter, but in a good way. Zoe stopped shrinking when she talked about her grades. Austin stopped hiding his report cards. And Kevin slowly started being a father instead of a warden to one child and a cheerleader to the other. I still kept my notes app. I just didn't need to add to it as often anymore. If this story moved you, hit subscribe for more real-life stories about family, boundaries, and standing up for the people you love. New stories every week.